You're listening to the Business Communicators, presented by IABC Houston. And now your hosts, Austin Staton, Hattie Horn, and Thomas Baen.
Welcome to Season 3, Episode 14 of the Business Communicators, a podcast presented by IABC Houston. My name is Austin Staton, and I'm joined alongside Thomas Baen this week. And you might notice that Hattie Horn is not joining us on screen, and it's not because she doesn't love our audience, our listeners. It's because we had some insane storms in Houston this week, and if you watch the news, whether you are in the US, Canada, or abroad, you've probably heard about the unmitigated disaster that happened in the state of Texas with the power grid and cold storms. And unfortunately, Hattie was impacted by this and is currently working with a plumber to have some pipe damage fixed in her house. So we wish Hattie the best, and we can't wait to have her join us again next week. But on that note, we wanted to bring in a subject matter expert who is no stranger to the cold weather. So we turned to the north, and our friend Dan Gold, who joins us from the Great White North. And Dan is an award-winning global MarComs strategist, a public speaker, digital media guru, fellow podcaster. And of course, you can find him on social media. Just search at Dan Gold Media. Dan, thank you so much for filling in for Hattie this week. We appreciate it.
Well, I'm honored to be here. It's my sincere wishes that she gets everything fixed as soon as possible. I'm really going to make the most of this opportunity, though, Hattie. And I'm a big fan of this podcast, and I listen to a lot of them. This is absolutely up there as one of the best. So it's an honor to be here.
We're definitely excited to have you join us. And for full disclosure, we actually reached out to Dan prior to these storms coming. It just so happens that Hattie couldn't make it, so we were able to say that he's pinch hitting. But we're really excited to have you, Dan, on the show this week. And Thomas, I feel like I owe you an apology. You know, a few weeks ago on the podcast, I said, we're not a weather podcast. I said, we're not going to talk about that. Because you were discussing a cold front that was coming in and being able to wear pants for, you know, the holiday season. And man, did I mess up by jinxing us and bringing this cold weather here to Texas. So we're actually going to discuss it this week. But Thomas, how are you holding up?
I'm holding up good. You know, kids at home, no power for almost 2 days, just under 2 days. Water pressure in and out, now on a boil notice. So having to remember the old school Mexico rules of don't brush your teeth with tap water, having to kick in. I guess those calls for the Houston Visitor Bureau to sponsor us might need me a little more heard or not heard right now. But no, holding up great. Glad that we have power. Glad that we can do this and learn more about, you know, when we complain that it's cold at 30 degrees and Dan's like, it's like negative 10 degrees here. What's going on?
And Dan, I feel like I kind of jinxed the state of Texas as well by talking smack on a yearly basis whenever you're up in Canada and you post about, I don't know, the weather being 30 degrees below zero. And I always send a screen cap of the temperatures of Texas. And I did this a few weeks ago. You posted that it was like minus 30, wind chill at like minus 50 or something absurd like that. I sent a screen cap showing that Houston was 75 degrees. Came back to haunt. That's on me. That's on me, folks.
Well, in true Texas form, we're going to be at 70 degrees like Monday when it boils down to it. I always like to say that Texas has about 3 to 4 weeks of winter, but it's not 3 or 4 weeks together. It's like, here's a day of freezing, and the next day it's 80 degrees. Oh, here's 2 days of freezing, and then it's going to stay in the 50s. So it's really what that boils down to it. So Dan, what is the weather like where you're from?
Well, for the latest weather update, here we go. It's pretty good currently, and I, you know, straight from the horse's mouth as us. Well, I'm British. Let's just get that out the way first. I am in Canada. I know there's going to be people listening to this who haven't been on the old IABC podcast that I did last couple of years. I'm from the UK. I now live in the middle of Canada. Literally, if you drew a line either side, got to the middle, that's where I am. So if you draw a line from where you guys are upwards, you'll probably be more or less somewhere nowhere near me. So the temperature at the moment, it's about minus 18 Celsius. Have no idea what it is in old money, but I do know that 2 weeks ago when I got that message from Austin. And Austin, I'm not going to rub this in because of what you've been going through. And it's been a serious weather event for a lot of people. But with wind chill, and I went out walking in this, it was minus 62.5 Fahrenheit. And I did 3 kilometers in that. I regretted it, but I did do it. I have no plan on ever doing that again. But I can tell you, you're saying about the weather returning to 80 degrees the next day. I can tell you this. We have 7+ months of winter, and then we have this really rapid run of summer, and then it's done. And it's as soon as summer starts, it's construction season. Everything's getting built. The roads are horrific, but they have to do the work from all the damage from the ice and the weather. And then you're just counting down to when's it going to snow again, which is beautiful. But I have to say, it's a gorgeous part of the world.
Well, that makes sense that every time I see you, it's always in like a warm environment, you know, like California or something like that. So anyways, we're definitely glad to have you on. And we're going to talk more about the situation in Texas coming up here on the podcast. We're also going to dive into some news out of Australia that is maybe changing the way that the media and social media interact. I think that's going to be an interesting conversation. But really quickly, if you want to follow our work, you can just search at Biz Communicator on all of the social media platforms. If you want to give us feedback, we definitely encourage that you leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. That's the preferred way, but you can also interact with us on LinkedIn, whatever social media platform works for you. Of course, you can text podcast to 713-360-0133 or send us an email to podcast@ibchouston.com for any comments, questions, show ideas, or anything that you would like to hear. But really quickly, before we get into the news in Texas, I do want to read some feedback that we got, Thomas, on the Pearl Milling Company. If you go to our LinkedIn page, one of our listeners, John Slavny, who is based in Madison, Wisconsin, left this comment. He said, "I like the story behind the name change. It salutes company history, locates the company in the American heartland, and delivers a bonus by identifying the company as a producer of grain products. And they're nicely providing continuity by way of packaging," which is something that you alluded to, Thomas. "I don't find the name all that clunky." Austin, that's, you know, I definitely said it was clunky. It has a certain concrete charm. Also, of course, the company deserves a lot of credit for ridding itself of its problematic identity, even when doing so was bound to generate ugly backlash. So, John, we appreciate the comments and the sentiment, and thank you for listening all the way up that far north. We definitely do appreciate that. Also, we did have another comment as well from Joanne Henry. This week, she said, so far the podcasts in 2021 are off to a terrific start. And she was referring to the Chris Brogan episode, saying that, agree that you should also ask at people who say that they're authentic. I'm also a bit skeptical of people who say they have a high integrity. Say that you value it, sure, but with integrity, well, no. It's not what you say, it's what you do when no one is watching. So, Joanne, thank you for the comments. John, thank you for the comments. And of course, if you have any other comments or feedback, definitely let us know. We love discussing them. We love seeing them on the show. But guys, let's talk about the situation in Texas. And for those of you that have been living under a rock for the past week, it's not really breaking news that Texans, you know, myself, Thomas, Hattie, we can't handle the cold. Winter Storm Uri basically knocked out the state of Texas. And for those not familiar with the situation, really quickly, Texas is on its own power grid. And this is kind of where the main issues came. So in the United States, there are 3 main power grids. You've got the West Coast, you've got the East Coast, and then Texas deregulated several years ago. Now, what this means is if there's a crisis in California, California can draw energy from neighboring states to help, you know, mitigate some of the strain on the power grid. So they can hopefully keep, you know, people's homes warm and energized. They might have to do rolling blackouts, but at least it's more, it's not prolonged, we'll put it that way. Texas, on the other hand, they are under control of the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, also known as ERCOT, which is just completely ironic in itself. And Texas has prided itself on being independent and staying away from federal regulations. And as a result of wind turbines freezing, natural gas pipelines freezing, nuclear power plants going offline, Texas was hammered on Sunday night into Monday morning, and millions of people lost power in their homes. Currently in Texas, Thomas and I believe, got power back 3 days after everything went off. Our city is still under a boil water notice, so it's very difficult to find grocery stores within the state of Texas that have supplies, even as simple as water and food. So that's incredibly challenging for the state. And because Texas is independent, we can't draw on other states' energy resources for support. So we're not going to focus on exactly what happened, but more the communications side of it and the crisis.
Lack of communications.
Lack of communication. Yeah.
Sorry to interject there, Austin, but it had to be said.
Yeah, the lack of communications and effective crisis management. And Thomas and Dan, when I look at this situation in Texas, I think it was a disaster from the start. Many public officials, government officials, ERCOT, they knew that this storm was coming for weeks. Preparedness was not there. Communicating to your citizens on what to do, how to conserve and manage power, that was not done. And even when we look at the system itself, there have been studies done plenty of times over the past decade saying that Texas needs to winterize or weatherize its power grid. They did not do that in order to save money. And here we are, just a few days removed from about a third of the state not having power, and most of the state right now not even having access to clean water. How do we get here?
It's interesting you mentioned that, because ERCOT being the governing body of the power grid, for lack of a better statement, I think that's what makes Texans so frustrated about the whole ordeal, was that we knew it was coming. And it wasn't like a week or a day. It was like, here's 3 weeks. There's some big storms coming down. Let's prepare. Because the power outages weren't from fallen lines. They weren't from the natural disaster itself. It was because we self-inflicted it. And so I think that's why the Texans are the most upset about it, is because it's the freezing pipes. Yeah, that's more Mother Nature. Granted, having power probably would have prevented a lot more of them from breaking. But that's what it is. The real challenge is when all this information is going on, and so you have all these people doing without power, but yet they're broadcasting their messages through television. I don't know how you get to see that. And then by the power being out means that everybody's home internet was down. So now your cell phone signals and your websites were now spotty at best. You'd send a message and you'd get either confirmation that it went through an hour later, or that it didn't get through 2 hours later. And so a lot of the information was coming just from different areas. I thought it was really interesting that just the blame game that immediately started just
within hours.
Yeah. And it reminds me of a quote. I got to pull it up so I quote it properly, because I won't do it justice. It is from The Big Short, about looking at the crisis thing. Is the truth at this time is like poetry, and people don't like poetry. I paraphrased it and I used the clean version of it for our listeners. And in crisis management, it's the empathy. This has case study on top of case study on top of case study of it. I think Austin said it best when the last message that went out from ERCOT was at 4:59, and they were radio silent till 8 o'clock the next morning.
Yeah. That's a huge issue. And I think that one thing that everyone is taught if they've gone through crisis communications training, and if you haven't gone through crisis communications training, FEMA is a really good resource. They have the incident command staff, which is ICS 100, 200, and 300. Dan, I'm not sure what it is in Canada, but it's really good training that I think every communicator should know. And for businesses, at least in my background, you're taught a few things initially when a crisis happens. One, always overreact and then assess status. Overreacting means that you're putting resources on standby. You're letting people know, hey, this potential storm is coming. Hey, this disaster happened. Get ready. We don't know if we're going to need you, but we're putting you on standby just in case we have to deploy you. And then your priorities have to be people. They have to be the environment, then the property, and then the business. The problem with ERCOT is they knew this was coming for a week. And I know that storms are unpredictable, but they knew that it was coming for a week, and none of those priorities were checked off. Dan, as an outsider, not being from Texas, what are your initial thoughts on this crisis, and what steps would you take from a crisis comms perspective to maybe do this again or do this differently, or, advice that you would give for companies maybe going through something similar in the future?
The issues management on this has been appalling. I haven't seen everything from within the organization. There hasn't been a post-mortem of those processes and procedures, and that will come out in the wash. If there isn't a transparent learning and listening and learning exercise from that, and procedures changed as a result, there will be people culpable, and the failures must not be allowed to happen again. The common issue that I see around this is that an organization says, well, it's a 1 in 1,000 year event, 1 in 100, 1 in 200. It's not, so we're not going to put resources into this because we've got pressures, blah blah. And some of those justifications may be legitimate, but when you're inside that bubble of that organization, too often it's very easy to go, yeah, that makes sense. I can look at my budget and the likelihood of this, what are the odds? Back home, every time it snows, and it snows in England, Scotland's slightly different, but in England it snows maybe 1 to 3 days a year. It's about that much, and it turns into sludge. The country stops, and immediately everyone comes out and goes, why weren't we prepared for this? Well, it wasn't the environment for it. We're not going to have snow clearing machines and put that money into it. Well, that makes sense if you look at it from a budget point of view. But when you look at the human impact point of view, it's something very different. So you do these ongoing assessments. For organizations, it's no different. I think that what you've both identified and spoken quite clearly about here is that this wasn't something that came on in 20 minutes, 40 minutes, 2 hours, or even the night before. It was seen to be coming. So I would take lessons from this. Look, there's very dark sides of any tragedy. There's dark sides of anything like this that happens, and they're called crises for a reason. But again, for private organizations, look at things like this and look at that guidance and just say, okay, well, if this was my organization, what could I do? How could I apply lessons from this to what we do? And one of the things when I part of my role is crisis communications training. One of the things I say to people is, let's go to a whiteboard and throw up all the things that could happen to your organization. Let's put them into 3 columns. Probably, maybe, and unlikely. With those 3 columns, just put all the events that you could think that could impact you, your customers, your reputation, your supply chain. How about your organization getting crippled by something happening on the other side of the country because they're in your supply chain? Put it on the board, look at it, and then run through the scenarios. I'm sorry to say, storms happen. Nature happens. If that board had been looked at properly, regardless of the budget, it would have been very easy to go, okay, well, how are we going to deliver our messages in a timely fashion? Because as you know, within a crisis, communicating in a timely fashion is critical, and making sure that your message isn't only broadcast, but it's heard and it's understood and acted on. What can we do to make sure that the messages that are going out are understood, complied with? I mean, let's say there was an evacuation order and something just went out, some other, crisis scenario. Instruction went out to people to go, hey, you got to get out of location X, but you put it in a format or in a place where no one gets to see that message. I'm not going to talk about effectiveness of message. How does that actually impact the human beings? How does that save people's lives? And it's always the case for me, working back, worst case scenario, preparation, get that planning in place and run scenarios. How many times do organizations have a great crisis plan or a folder, the binder in the office, the binder at home, maybe a digital version on the phone or whatever it is, but then it's not updated. And it was done maybe 7 years ago, but no one's opened the folder, or we haven't really looked at it. And the truth is, as along with your fire drills that you do in your business, along with checking the integrity of the passwords for your organization, that crisis plan should be rehearsed, reviewed, updated, tested. If it isn't, it's a structural failure for the organization.
100%. I think, I worked in the energy industry for 9 years. And the company that I worked for had a major crisis back in 2010, one that almost crippled the company. And the company is still, feeling the effects of it today. But one of the things that we did is every year we would do 2 to 3 crisis drills. We would do them at different assets. We would do them with different government officials. And I think it was helpful for us in preparing for even the minor crises that we had. The onset of COVID-19, I was the public information officer for the first 2 weeks of that crisis in the Gulf of Mexico. And I think my training helped me lead an effective communications plan. And granted, we weren't externally communicating. We had to build up an incident management team specifically for our employees and communicating our COVID response, especially for the offshore employees. And I think that was so critical. And we were prepared. We were wargaming this, weeks before the crisis became a crisis. And I think that, you have to have that foresight when it comes to communications. And something that I kind of want to go back to that Thomas mentioned a little bit earlier, and Dan, you alluded to this as well. Communication channels are also so important. What happened, what worked 10 years ago, putting stuff out there on TV and radio, that's not how people operate today. People aren't going to go sit in their cars and listen to FM radio. I couldn't tell you the last time that I listened to a radio station. Most of the time when I listen to something now, it's on Spotify or a podcast app. I'm not listening to FM radio stations. I don't even know what the FM radio stations are here in Houston. Is that on me? Probably a little bit, but you've got to go where the people are. Is it social media? Is it text alerts? Is there some sort of emergency response number that can call people? I think that this is something that the state has to modernize, and the country really has to modernize in order to meet Americans where they are when it comes to advancing technology. So maybe that, means working with Silicon Valley, trying to leverage some sort of app, or maybe it's working with the telecom industry and trying to figure out a text messaging system. But when you look back at ERCOT and some of their initial communications, they were trying to take that Wendy's roasting approach for some of their first initial comments. And these tweets are still up, by the way, as the time that we're recording, which is Friday afternoon. And so we'll put them on the screen right now if you're watching this on YouTube. But they sent one out that said, "Close your blinds to conserve heat." It's a pretty good message, right? Pretty straightforward. That's a great piece of advice. But then they close it with this: "You already know what it looks like outside." It's a little bit tone deaf. Here's another one. The message is, "Unplug the fancy new appliances you bought during the pandemic and only used once. #conserve." Why not just say, unplug appliances? It could create an issue when the power does come back online. Like, why be snarky? Especially when you're not openly, transparently communicating with the public. Why take this approach on social media?
I'd just like to say on that point, communication generally, when you are an organization which is a trust-based, utility-facing organization, you're not in the consumer space. It's not necessarily your game to be funny. And when it's media training away from crisis, or maybe it's a part of crisis, I say to organizations anyway, how funny do you think you are? Room full of people, back when we had a room full of people, but a room full of people. And I'd say to them, okay, who's the funniest in the room? And they'll all point to someone. And then they'll say something funny. It'll be great. And there was this one time I was doing media training. There was this person who was amazing in the room. We recorded it. We then went into interview, and their defense mechanism was actually humor. They were just one of those funny people who had quips, and they we were interviewing them, and they got nervous, and there were these things that they were saying. But when we did playback, they looked at themselves, because we always say, hey, you tell us what you think, then what does the room think, and then we'll tell you what we think and we'll give you the pointers. Let's really learn from this. How disrespectful it came across, how flippant it came across, how arrogant it came across. And from what you're saying of these messages, that's exactly where I'd be with the sensitivity around this, remembering that the use of humor is a great tool for messaging in the right space at the right time. But a bit like, a grandmaster painting or modern art, it's all, the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It's how I perceive what you're saying. And from those messages from ERCOT, I look at that and go, wow. It to me, it feels disrespectful. And when something feels bad, you can't quantify that by, let's see what the responses are on Hootsuite or whatever it is. What's the sentiment like? Oh yeah, we really got that wrong.
It's interesting because I come from it a little different. I haven't had the crisis media training. I've had the crisis management training. And so I've had to look at, how do we get people out? When was the last time the crisis plan was really there? And I come from this, simple point to the point. And I think it's interesting that Austin made a military reference, because I believe in that training, so that you train enough that it's second nature. So you're not thinking about it. If something's happening, this is what you do. You don't have time to think. You only have time to act. But even with that, with the media or the crisis management training, I think it's funny because you're talking about making all your list. I've always sat down to the room. Well, what about this? And anytime the C-suite says, well, that's never going to happen here, that's the first one we work on, period.
It's the same thing with that Mike Tyson quote, right? You can have the best game plan going into a boxing match, but it all goes out the window when you get punched in the face. It's the exact same thing in a crisis situation. Once you get knocked down, you've got to use your training. You've got to rely on your skills to be able to get back up and work through it. And I think the state of Texas, ERCOT, our government officials, I think they failed. And Thomas, I do want to ask you about this, because you this is one of the first things that you mentioned. When this whole crisis started, it was less than 24 hours before you had Republican government officials pointing the finger at renewable energy and wind, when the bulk of the problem was actually natural gas pipelines freezing and then a nuclear power plant going offline. So they were trying to make this political within the first 24 hours. And then at the local level, you have government officials that are doing the right thing. They're obviously saying that their top priority is the people and trying to restore power to get it back on as quickly as possible. But then they're pointing the fingers up at the state level. And then the power companies so just for more context, here we have CenterPoint Energy, and CenterPoint Energy is more the distributor, right? So they can go to the ERCOT power grid and then distribute the energy that's there to its subscribers, its customers, as they call them. They were pointing the finger at ERCOT. And it was just so frustrating to see the lack of collaboration from our local, our federal, and our state level, stakeholders, and then also the business world. And I feel like that is not indicative of how Texas has responded in the past. I mean, we've seen the good from companies like H-E-B, which is a huge grocery store here in Texas, Mattress Mac, opening up his doors at Gallery Furniture and bringing in, so many people. Why couldn't we get it right this time, Thomas?
You talk about the communications playbook. I'm starting to think that there's a politician's playbook, because you saw this during Katrina. The local government blamed the state government blamed the federal government. Here you see the local blaming the state blaming the state. Federal doesn't really have as much to play with it because we are our own power grid, so the federal government doesn't have a whole lot to do with it. I quickly, before the podcast, was doing a little research, and 8 days after Katrina struck, state and federal officials said they're finally starting to work together. This was the CBS report on September 7th. The other challenge is that the weather event, it happens about every 10 years, and every 10 years they're told this is what it's going to warn about. And to finish off quoting another movie, The Big Short, I have a feeling that in a few years, people are going to be doing exactly what they did when the economy tanks. They're going to point the fingers at each other, nothing's going to happen, and we're going to be right back to normal. So politicians, if you're listening, please work with your communications experts to help a communications plan, not a politician plan. Or you can do what one of our politicians did and just fly to Cancun where it was 80 degrees.
Yeah. A note to the politicians out there. I don't care if you're liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat. I guess we do have to throw in libertarian in there too. During times of crisis, it's not about you. It's about the people that you represent. And keep that at the top of your mind when responding to a crisis. Know that if you want to get reelected in 6 years and 4 years and 2 years, you've got to take care of the people. You've got to show that you stepped up, that you worked across the aisle, and that you led in a time of crisis. And I'm not sure that I saw that with our leaders. And I think that was incredibly frustrating. But I'll tell you one good thing that I did find. And it was on social media. Facebook, which has taken a lot of heat over the years, for spreading misinformation, for too much data. I think that one thing that Facebook does incredibly well is they can bring people together and find resources. I mean, I remember after Hurricane Harvey, there were groups that were set up in Houston. If you needed people to help clear out your home or fix, drywall or bring supplies, you could find groups like that on Facebook, and people were sharing updates. It was just so incredible to see the community rally behind each other. And today when I logged onto Facebook, so Friday afternoon, there was a post, and I'll put it up on the screen right now. If you're watching on YouTube, it says, Austin, help people in your area affected by the winter storm. Together, we can help support each other during the extreme weather and power outages. Let people near you know if you need or can offer supplies, volunteer services, or other types of assistance. And then there's a place where you can scroll, and you can see if people have medical requests, if they have a family that's going through a healthcare situation and they need power. If someone is trying to find a local plumber, you can find it on Facebook. So I do want to give kudos to Facebook and kind of stepping up and helping the community collaborate and work through this together. And I think in this case, it's big tech doing good for society.
I think that's interesting because Facebook, for a long time, I think it was after the tsunamis in the Philippines, where they had the check-in that you send one message, I'm okay, to your friends and family, so they didn't have to go through all of that information. Looking at journalism.org, 18% of people get their news or information from that. And the whole purpose for the social media was to be able to talk to your friends, not necessarily to sway political views or anything like that, or to show pictures of your kids to your family. What was the whole purpose of social media? And so I think that's good that they're getting back to what it is they originally were designed to do.
Yeah, it's
connect people.
It's connecting people. It's bringing together community, and I think that's incredibly important. And I would like to see social media continue to do that. I mean, Dan, up in Canada, when you have cold climates or you have some sort of issue that's going on in the community, I imagine it's a similar situation with people sharing information and in trying to help one another via these social media platforms.
I have to say the invention of groups has been the biggest single game changer to the Facebook ecosystem, particularly because suddenly, based on geography, it could be people that you're not directly connected with your friend group or whatever it might be, but it will be people who are physical neighbors or within your neighborhood, and you can really help people. I put a message out recently and someone else replied and they helped our family, and it was an amazing change. But one of the things that is fascinating to me is there's one part which is, it's very easy for us to demonize social media platforms because of what people do on those platforms. But actually the people are human beings. It's people like us and people very much not like us, and this collision of different ethics and beliefs and different ways of thinking, and some who are very forward in their opinions and others who will shrink and not say things, and those who will be hurt by it. I think that things like that you've mentioned, Austin, with those facilities bringing people together purposefully for good is fantastic. But I've seen equal amounts of good and bad on every platform. Even down to Clubhouse in the last week, I've heard things that have been, anti one group, anti another group, and then pro. It just depends the conversation that you're involved with. I do believe there is responsibility from the platforms to manage these situations in a more effective way. But it's a difficult space. And would I like to go out and create a social network and invest in it and put all those billions in and get an awful lot back from it? Sure. But the level of responsibility when we've got to talk about our fellow human beings and a platform, it's almost the demonization of a platform or a technology, when actually the problem is how society deals with itself, and we speak to each other as much as anything.
Yeah, very interesting, Dan. And I guess I'll have to follow you on Clubhouse. I didn't know you were on Clubhouse, but I think Thomas and I will definitely follow you on Clubhouse. And if you missed our Clubhouse conversation on last week's episode of the podcast, go ahead and go to our YouTube channel or LinkedIn. We've got the probably about the 8 or 9 minute clip up there where Hattie, Thomas, and I discuss it. But on the issue of social media, Thomas did mention journalism.org and the Pew Research Center. And back in July of 2020, they had a report that said Americans who mainly get their news on social media are less engaged and less knowledgeable. And I don't know if you guys have been following the news out of Australia, but in Australia, and this is sort of something that Thomas alluded to and predicted in past episodes, but there was a news blackout on Facebook. Facebook finally said, all right, look, we're not going to allow any news post at all on social media platform in Australia. And the reason behind this is there was sort of a dispute between print and TV in Australia versus the social media platforms. And I guess it really all goes down to advertising and dollars. When you look at a decade ago, 80% of advertising market in Australia was controlled by offline media. That number has fallen by half over the last 10 years. And most of that has gone to Facebook and Google in terms of ad revenue. So these media companies that are taking the time, paying employees and putting out these stories, they wanted a little bit of compensation, just to make things right. And Facebook didn't want to negotiate. They said no. And so they blocked all news in Australia. Is this dangerous when it comes to open access to information for the world moving forward? Or is this just sort of an isolated incident? Or what is the solution or compromise here?
I think they wanted more of like the subscription to where Facebook or Google pays a certain percentage. It goes back to that statement is that if the product's free, then you're the product. And so by them putting their news out there and Google scraping it or Facebook scraping it and posting it in there, there's no competition, to your point, of paying those reporters who are doing quality reporting. Google, on the other hand, has actually turned around and said, hey, we're going to pay some of the Australian broadcasting companies and the other things some fees to let them on there. But Facebook took it a step further. Is here in the United States, we can't even quote news from Australia on Facebook. It's one of those big brothers watching technology. It's like, oh, you mentioned Australia, can't say anything about the news. I do think it's dangerous, but in my heart, I'm siding more with the journalist because I want fair, balanced, unbiased media reporting that's accurate and not first. And so I would like them to pay. I don't know if it's $1 million. I don't know if it's $1. I don't know what the specs of it are, but I'm for Australia saying, you need to pay for us to be able to run this quality stuff. That's my take on it. What's your thought, Dan, being from Canada?
My background is from the world of broadcasting. So technology firm, media, 100%. I am in the space of what's best for the people. And I mean this from the sense of, without effective investigative journalism, good journalism, storytelling, those stories being told within communities nationally, holding power to account, etc., unless that has a place to be told, I'm always going to say that people are going to lose out. It's a case of choice. The citizen can still go and buy the newspaper. The citizen can still go to the individual website of the media outlet. How much are they driven to go and do that? That is the question. They've got very used to a friend posting an article from the ABC or Channel 9 or Channel 10 or Channel 7 or whoever, and suddenly that has stopped. So it's the virile nature of a story being posted by a friend that then they comment on, add their opinion, and that discourse that goes with it that is suddenly stopped. My friend, who is an IT guy, he sent out a Bitly link with a link to a news article, and Facebook didn't block the Bitly link because they don't scan links. Good and bad, you might say, in that sense. Consumers still have a choice of where to consume their news. However, it's very easy once you get into the Facebook ecosystem or a platform's ecosystem to just scroll, comment, read, scroll, and yes, link off to that news outlet. There is a responsibility by big tech corporations to not negatively, I'm not going to say that their job is to positively affect society. Some might say that, but it's their job not to negatively affect a society. When there is so much misinformation, when there are lookalike articles being shared by people, and you cut off the legs of an authentic media outlet to tell that story so that people can look at both of these and evaluate for themselves, well, that's a major media outlet, my trust is with them, I'm fine. That's not good for society. That's negative. Sure, I can see the argument. I've followed the Australian argument for a long time because in the UK, we've been saying to platforms, one, you need to pay taxes in market. Two, you need to compensate creators for the work that they do. Why will you pay someone who's in your partnership program for video plays, but you won't pay someone who writes an article and has producers and researchers and rights people working on articles? We can't have a platform negatively affecting society. So I think that it's brinksmanship in Australia. I think they will come to a deal. It will be fairly quickly. And I think that Facebook, I don't know, I'm not on the inside of the organization, but if it was the best thing for that corporation, the best thing for them to do is to get into those negotiations. It just seems like a bit of strongman at the moment. Get round the table, get an agreement done, agree to pay X amount, and maybe it's reviewed every 5 years or whatever it is. But at the point where, if we go back to Zuck, when he was saying, Facebook had no influence on the 2016 election. Well, if you chopped off every political post at that point on your platform and only kept it to kittens and puppies, well, yeah, you wouldn't have had any influence. What's on the platform matters. What people say matters. So by putting a block in, that is a negative thing. And I'm intrigued to hear what you guys think from the point of view of, what if this happened in America? Would there be an uproar, or would people just carry on and go, well, we didn't miss it anyway?
Well, it's interesting because I think the demographics for Facebook in the United States are starting to trend more older. I think the younger generation, they're more TikTok, they're more Instagram. That's where they get their news. I still think people get their news from social media, but the younger generations, I'm not sure it's quite Facebook. But as you mentioned with the 2016 election, Facebook played an important role. There's a reason why Donald Trump, instead of spending all this money on TV ads, spent so much money on digital ads that were on Facebook. There's a reason why the Lincoln Project we spoke last week about spent so much on digital ads rather than TV ads. It's because that's where you reach people, and it's much cheaper and effective to do so. I am curious to see if Facebook, who has tried to reach out into this like Facebook news thing in the past few years, but they've never really gotten it off the ground. I'm curious if they try to adapt like the Apple News approach, right? Where you get certain stories for free and they pay, for access to the Washington Post, New York Times. And then if you want the premium access, you get that. I'm curious if Facebook decides to go that route. I think that could be interesting to follow. I did want to read this quote real quick from Scott Morrison, who's the Prime Minister. He actually wrote on Facebook that the company's actions to, quote, unfriend Australia would, quote, only confirm the concerns that is increasing the number of countries are expressing about the behavior of big tech companies who think they are bigger than governments and the rules should not apply to them. I don't know that I necessarily agree that Facebooks are bigger than governments, or tech is bigger than government, and they're trying. I don't think this is a government issue. I think this is an issue between B2B. Thomas, am I wrong? I think this is a B2B issue and not a business to government issue.
Yes and no, because the pen is mightier than the sword. In this case, the computer's mightier than the sword. We rely on the media, the FTC here in the United States, so that in times of crisis, as we're talking, we have the ability to broadcast those messages reliably, whether it's traditional radio, whether it's this, whether it's that. The media's rules and laws here in the States were written back in, 96? So they're a little antiquated and dated. And again, I fear that them taking Facebook off of it is going to open it up more for the conspiracy theorists and drive that divide anymore. Because all it takes is one person to take one little tidbit of truth and then just to run wild with it. And there will be no background. Growing up in the United States, being a citizen, believing in the First Amendment, freedom of speech, it's really hard for me to sit there and say that I'm coming from that school of thought that our professional organizations, PRSA, AMA, and our title sponsor, IABC, should come together and actually figure out some sort of universal certifications, licensing codes, so that when we post something about the news, it's moved to the top of the food chain. When we combat those fake things, it's moved to the top of the food chain, saying this is an actual person who's taken studies, who has ethics, who can lose their license and their ability to do that. But I think the Prime Minister said it best, because here in the States, there's a lot of states right now that are going after ad revenue for Facebook because it is a good and service that is in their state. And when millions and billions of dollars that could be going to build infrastructure, dangerous word there, should be there. And I do think Facebook and all the social media, you read about India and Twitter, they're at war with each other right now about the blocking of certain ones and letting so
the agricultural issues. Yeah.
Is that at some point in time there has to be a mutual understanding, and without that mutual understanding, and whether it's the government playing the mediator or whether it's the media outlets and the social media coming together naturally, which I don't think will, because they're all about money. Not all about money, but ad revenue is definitely their driving force on a lot of it. So I'm really hoping that they work it out. Here in the United States, we work it out. Here in England, they work it out, because I remember hearing about that. Because, by the way, the BBC is an amazing public broadcast there. The Canadian broadcast system, that's pretty entertaining as well, for certain things. It is just they've got to find a common ground, and they have to work on it, not just for business and not just for communications, but for the good of society.
Yeah, I think you kind of hit the nail there. The good of society. And I think that's the lesson that we should take away from today's episode. At the end of the day, kindness matters. Whether it's in a crisis situation, whether it's in businesses, doing the right thing matters. In times of crisis, reach out to people. I think that was one of the most incredible things this past week. I had people reaching out from all over across the country, asking how I was doing. And personally, I was fine. Didn't have power for 3 days, but at the end of the day, my apartment was still relatively warm compared to a lot of people here in Houston. But it meant a lot to have people call, text, check in, see how I was doing. So I think that's the lesson here. In communications, do the right thing, show empathy, respect people, and we'll get along just fine. It's not that hard to be a decent human being. I think that's kind of what I want to say. But to close this episode out, some of our listeners know that I moved a few weeks ago, and I was packing up my books and unpacking the books, and I came across a writing journal. 400 writing prompts. I have no idea where I got this. I think it's something that my mom got me for my birthday or Christmas or something like that. It has nothing in here. So I thought it'd be fun to start a new segment on the show. And instead of writing prompts, we're going to do some extemporaneous speaking, if you will. So, Dan, I want you to tell me when to stop. I'm going to scroll through this right now. Tell me when to stop.
Stop.
All right. Thomas, left or right?
Let's go right, but before we choose this, I also want to get our audience to interact with us. So this is a test for you, but you get more than the however many seconds I'm about to get from Austin on
yes,
this.
we're gonna post this on social media. We're gonna post the prompt, and we're gonna see what people say. But Thomas, you said right. Now, Dan, give me a number 1, 2, or 3.
Oh, 2.
All right, the prompt, and I'm not cheating. It says, name something simple that brings you joy. So to close out this episode, Thomas, we'll start with you. Name something simple that brings you joy.
Personally, this is a communications podcast, and I'm going to go with simple communications. There's the inherent beauty of a simple message, whether it's a logo design, whether it's a graphic artist, whether it's Mother Nature, or whether it's a simple kind of communications form. It's the beauty in the simplicity. It's being able to get your message across in as little resources as possible that sings a song or that paints a picture or is in concert with each other. So simplicity, the keep it simple is what I find beauty in. I kind of might be a minimalist, I guess.
Dan, what about you? What brings you joy?
Well, firstly, I'd like to say we've actually I'm a partner of a podcast production company in the UK, and we have a whole podcast built around using one of those books.
That is hilarious.
For the whole episode. So I'm loving that you're doing this. That joy for me is truth. There is nothing, whether you are communicating, whether you are receiving information, the pleasure of knowing, no matter how hard a piece of news is, that it is the truth, that you don't have to decipher it, you don't have to work out, evaluate on that level of, the scale of trust, but it's just truth. When someone tells me, no matter how bad the news is, something that's truthful, it makes me happy to know that there's the relationship that is based around that truth and trust. So that's it for me.
I like it.
I want to amend mine, and just so I don't forget, since it's business communications, it's also my wife and kids. Love you, honey. Had to do that, I'm backpedaling a little bit.
See, it goes down to honesty.
In fairness, if he's backpedaling, then I'm adding simple joys, my children sleeping at night, because it means not only can we go for wine o'clock, but it's also the fact that they're happy. If they're happy and they're asleep and they're healthy, we're good, So just to add that.
I like it.
Yeah, simple joys. I liked it, Dan. I liked your also time on wine o'clock. That's going to bring me happiness here in a couple of hours.
Well, last Thursday was International Drink Wine Day here in the United States. I think that needs to be a federal holiday. But simple things that bring me joy, I'm going to say connection. I'm very extroverted, and I think that's why 2020 was so difficult for me personally, is I didn't get the opportunity to travel. And one of my favorite things about traveling is to meet random people and have conversations with them, whether it's in a cafe, whether it's on a tour, whether it's, on a pub crawl. It doesn't matter. Just having conversations with somebody that has a completely different background than you, has completely different life experiences with you, making those connections and then continuing to develop relationships with them over the years, it's incredible. And that's something that brings me joy in life, or the connections, whether they are the long-term friendships or ones where you just meet someone and you click. I was very fortunate to really develop strong friendships in 2020 that I never thought that I would have. And it was just because of the pandemic and a random connection that all brought us together. So yeah, the simple things that bring you joy. We'll post this on social media. So if you want, just go ahead and write down in the comments below or leave us in a review. What is one thing in life that brings you that simple joy? Let us know, and we'll read some of the best on next week's episodes. But Thomas, Dan, it's been great to have you both on the Business Communicators this week. And for our listeners out there, if you want to follow our work, just search Biz Communicator on all of the social media platforms. If you want to send us comments or feedback, you can text podcast to 713-360-0133, or you can shoot us an email to podcast@ibchouston.com. And of course, our guest, Dan Gold, you can follow him on social media. Just search @DanGoldMedia. Guys, before we wrap things up, we do want to thank our sponsors, Pierpont Communications and MarComs & Co. They do amazing work. And if you need crisis communications, ERCOT, feel free to reach out to Pierpont. They do great work over there and can really help your company or your business thrive in a crisis situation and to mitigate any risk to your brand. And then MarComs & Co., they do amazing work with internal communications and change management. So definitely check them out as well. But Thomas and Dan, any parting words before we close this out?
I'd just like to say that if you are a publicly elected official and your citizens are going through tough times or a negative period, the idea of flying internationally for a holiday is probably a bad idea.
Probably. But I would like to go to Cancun right now. And here's a funny story real quick. Wednesday morning, before this whole Ted Cruz thing actually happened, I texted my fiance because we had no power. And I said, there's a $300 flight to Las Vegas that leaves this afternoon. Do you want to go? She was not foregoing. She, definitely had too much work and she was not interested. But I understand escaping cold weather. I almost did it.
They're called snowbirds for a reason. People who travel down to Florida and Texas during the winter and move back north during the summer. Yeah, I alluded to it as well about the flying international as an elected official. Wish I could as well. But my parting words is what we always talk about. Be kind, be better tomorrow as you were today. Step out of your comfort zone. Austin's mentioned the yes theory a couple times, but it's say yes to something. Bring in somebody who's not part of your group. Take a neighbor in, cook them a warm meal. Everybody could use it, but make sure you're socially distant 6 feet away.
Wear a mask too. That definitely helps. We did have some good breaking news from the Financial Times on Friday, saying that the Pfizer vaccine was 85% effective for the first dose, which I think is incredible news and could potentially mean that we get back to life in the new normal, I guess, sooner than later. But Dan, Thomas, it's been an amazing episode, 14 of season 3 of the podcast, and we thank all of our listeners for continuing to support us on this show. And Hattie, we hope that you're doing well, and we can't wait to have you back on the show next week. But on that note, on behalf of my co-hosts this week, Thomas Baen and Dan Gold, my name's Austin Staton. We'll see you next week.
You've been listening to the Business Communicators. If you haven't done so already, be sure to subscribe to our podcast on iTunes and leave us a 5-star review.